Hi, I'm Laura Williams with the Institute for Community and Adolescent Resilience and Wise Action Consulting. Welcome to Session 3, Plan and Uncertainty, which is part of a series for Muncie Web of Support Everybody Succeeds steering committee members. How have you been feeling lately? If you're like me, you're feeling overwhelmed. Sometimes you feel like you're up against things where success feels impossible. Maybe you're feeling really tired. Maybe you don't know what to expect. Maybe the rules feel like they're changing. And maybe you're curious again about what success is. Those are all signs of being in places where change is actually pretty complex. What do we mean by that? Let's take a look here. Complex change, as you see, fits in the middle between kind of a sense of things being fairly predictable and things being completely uncertain. If we look at the axes here as a degree of agreement and a degree of certainty, down in the lower left corner, where agreement might be high and certainty is high, we call that the zone of kind of stable space or predictable space. If you go to the other extreme, where there's low agreement and low certainty up in the far upper right corner, you can feel that being unstable or uncertain space. Complex space is the space in between, where there's varying degrees of agreement and certainty. And the tools I've been sharing with you are particularly a fit for places of complex change. Now, where you're standing may be any one of these, and it may depend on the issue. That's pretty normal. And we'll talk a little bit about all of those. So in this session, when we want to plan in the midst of uncertainty or complexity, how do we do it? What can we do to plan in those times and spaces where things aren't particularly certain or the issues aren't agreed upon? So why might these tips be useful in times of complex change? How does that fit for this moment? And what can you use or practice? The first tip I would say is to have a plan but hold it lightly. Holding a plan lightly means you can remain open to emerging opportunities and issues. This is key for learning in action, the skill we talked about in session 2. You hold a plan lightly when you create a plan and yet leave yourself open to noticing what is emerging and shifting and changing. You hold a plan lightly when you tell your planning group, your colleagues or whoever, what seems clear and what doesn't, making explicit the assumptions on which your plan is based, and recognizing that those change. As those change, your plan may change. You hold a plan lightly when you create something good enough to shape action for the next move or moment, but no more. You may think of other ways and times where you've held a plan lightly. A second tip is to plan again. It can be tempting to want to wait to plan until things settle down. When I worked in a local rape crisis center, I had a colleague who said, "We work in crisis, we can't plan." This is a common misperception and actually kind of a mistake. A plan can guide intentional action and help us communicate and coordinate with others. In particular, if there are things we can predict, we can nail those down and free up our energy for the places that are less certain or clear. In the midst of complex change, the trick is to let others know you will plan to plan again. In the midst of adjusting to COVID, for example, this has likely come fairly intuitively. For example, reopening in Minnesota was often framed as, here's our plan for the next 2 weeks. We'll reevaluate it then and let you know what the coming 2 weeks will be. Or during the initial escalation of protests around the killing of George Floyd, the governor's press conferences came at noon and 10 p.m., tune back tomorrow morning. The situation was rapidly changing, and so those were the benchmarks for checking in and planning again. How might that look for you in your planning? The third tip, look toward multiple horizons. These can be near term, mid range, and long term, which may mean creating multiple plans. In times of rapid and unpredictable change, you need to look at each of these horizons and match the level of detail with the degrees of freedom in the environment. So, for example, To the degree our long-term funding in my previous job was never secure, we didn't spend time detailing what our projects would look like in several years. But we did surface themes of what we wanted to accomplish and what the likely stakeholder uh, uh, preferences would be. We then fed that into our grant making process. Those are an example of looking towards multiple horizons and matching the scale of what you work on. Fourth tip is see the future from different points of view. We know that in complex change, the future can unfold in many different ways. There are just too many variables at work in a shifting environment for one person or one team to know what will happen. Including multiple and diverse voices can provide important context, open you up to a wider range of creative options, and put you and your team closer to identifying weak signals that are worth noting. It's particularly important for the fuzzy mid and long-term range planning to see multiple points of view. The fifth tip is to expect to stretch and fold. Two questions can really help us here. When we're stretching, we ask questions like, what more do we need to know? What else could happen? We may do adaptive action cycles. To fold, we often ask things about what is clear to us now. We need actually to do both of these in our planning processes. And while most of us know it can be useful to design these processes in or invite groups to decide which is fit for the moment you're in, sometimes it's hard to do. In times of rapid change, many of us want to find a place of stability where we can land, even for a moment. Folding encourages that. It can help us build coherence. It's not wrong to do. And there's definitely times where it's fitting. On the other hand, in times of uncertainty, many of us also think it's important to stretch, to learn as much as we possibly can about a situation, to push ourselves to think as creatively as we can, as we may not yet have agreement within ourselves or within our team or collaboration about what the next wise action is. Can you think of times you've stretched or folded, and how did that work and fit for the situation? We do actually do both of these all the time. This tip is simply an invitation to expect it and an invitation to harness these processes to facilitate your planning in uncertainty. Our next tip is to leave space for surprise. As we think about the other tips, this one actually makes sense. Sometimes we're advised to build in margins for failure, but that's not really what this is. When we build in a margin for surprise, we will notice different things. We'll support different kinds of questions and inquiry or stretching, and we'll be able to be adaptive in more creative and generative ways. How can this look in concrete ways? How can you build in places for surprise, or how have you in your planning in the past? Our next tip is to plan for every part of the landscape. Now here we're coming full circle to that diagram I started our session with those three zones of predictable, complex, and uncertain. You want to plan for each part of those. A structured and predictable space can take one kind of plan. Constantly shifting patterns, a different kind of plan. And total surprise, which fits a random, unstable, or uncertain space, that can take yet another kind of plan. These often overlap with time horizons that we talked about earlier, but that's not always the case. Some long-term factors are certain, like death and taxes, while some short-term are completely surprising, like the COVID pandemic, natural disasters, or something moving out of predictable space, like a peaceful transition of power. What did you notice about in your planning when you've planned for every part of the landscape? So, in summary, 7 tips for planning in the midst of uncertainty. Have a plan, but hold it lightly. Plan to plan again. Look toward multiple horizons. See the future from different points of view. Expect to stretch and fold. Leave space for surprise. And plan for every part of the landscape. Now, when might you use or practice it? Actually, anytime you feel stuck are good times to go to these tips. particularly when you are in complex space, when you're in unpredictable, unstable, emerging spaces. You can look to these tools. And definitely, as we move into our time as a steering committee and plan for the future together, we'll reference these and work to embedding them. Now, I've put each of these tips into the pre-session workbook for you to be able to reference there. And I encourage you to walk through the practice discussion to identify examples and ways you might use this tool. For more information, you're welcome to reach out to me at either of my email addresses. If you want to know more about the plans for the steering committee or have questions about what's next, please contact Kyra. And I also want to give a special thanks to the Human Systems Dynamics Institute, on which these tools and sessions are based. Thanks for participating and good luck with your practice. I look forward to seeing you at our first session together.